Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a lovely lunch. And for those of you new joining us, welcome to the 2021 Edinburgh, Lothians and Borders Archaeological Conference. Like all good conferences, we've got a few changes to our lineup as is traditional. And why change tradition in this time? Looking at the programme, the speakers, we have Dr. Natasha Ferguson. Unfortunately can't make it today, and she's kindly recorded her talk, and that'll come up first. We then move on to Ian, and instead of Tom Adamant, we have his colleague Liz Jones, who will be giving a presentation. Both will be live online, but we'll be able to accept questions from them in the traditional way. And as some of it, Natasha's work has been in Edinburgh, I might try and answer some of the questions that may arise from that report. And then we finish with Christine McPherson talking about the 50 years of the Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society, which probably quite a lot of you are either members or know the work. So I also just like to apologise on behalf of the speakers for those eagle-eyed, which I know a lot of you are eagle-eyed out there. You'll notice that the timings are slightly off. So for those, basically there's 20 minutes earlier than scheduled for the last two talks. So for those will be through the whole afternoon. Christine should be on about 14:05. But without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Callum, who will tee up, as my colleagues say, live VT. I'll have to say that. Live to Natasha Ferguson, who's going to give a recorded talk on new work on the changing rural and industrial landscapes around Edinburgh. So Callum, if you please. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I'm really sorry that I can't be here in person, but I will do my best here to do this presentation online. So we are looking today at changing rural and industrial landscapes around Edinburgh. So let me just share my screen. Great. So we are looking at two sites here that were excavated by GARD. That's New Craig Hall and Landlord, which are just situated on the outskirts of Edinburgh. And what I'd like to do today is to give you a summary of those excavations, what was found there, and also look at that landscape transformation from what we consider to be a medieval agricultural landscape to something that we would recognise more as an industrial landscape from the 19th and 20th centuries. However, what I'd also like to do is to look at the concept of the long industrial revolution and think about how we can change our longer term perspectives and how that change and transformation actually took place. Are we actually looking at a deindustrialisation going from agriculture to industry to agriculture? Or is there something much more complex going on here in those landscapes? I also like to just make a wee comment as well on urbanisation and potentially that being a new industrial revolution in a sense. I'm going to give a very brief summary. I've also only got a small amount of time within this presentation, but both of these excavations have been published in Arrow. And that's Archaeology reports online, which are produced by GARD Archaeology. So all the results are in both of those publications, and those are peer-reviewed research. Is also open access, and you can find lots of other excavations that have been done by GARD Archaeology, but by other units in Scotland too. Let's look at the locations of New Craig Hall and Landlord. We can see New Craig Hall there to the north, just to the west of Holyrood Park, and then Landlord being to the south west. Now at Landlord, what we had was evidence of coal mining and limestone quarrying. What we also saw in this landscape were evidence of medieval agriculture in the form of rig and furrow. What we didn't see actually, which was unexpected and which we saw in a site just across the road in West Edge Farm, was any prehistoric landscape. We didn't find any pits or post holes that we did in this other excavation, which we thought was quite unusual, and perhaps is something that is just either isn't present in the landscape or has been subsumed by the medieval landscape. There was also a linear drainage ditch, which we associated with the earlier quarrying activity. The fill within that ditch did contain white gritty ware, 13th century white gritty ware cooking pot, which you can see a picture of at the bottom there. There was also, within the environmental samples that we did, evidence of carbonised cereal grains, oats, barley and rye. What we did see from the fact that they were carbonised grains was the fact that there may be grain drying, a corn drying kiln nearby, and also potentially malting of these grains. So already what we're doing is creating a picture of this medieval rural agricultural landscape where these activities are taking place in and around the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. That's the carbon dating results that we got from those grains. What we did also see were the presence of coal seams, which were very close to the surface. And following those coal seams were small exploratory coal pits across the site. There were also evidence of 18th and 19th century coal shafts and large-scale limestone quarrying, which did leave quite a significant scar in the landscape. The actual dating of these small exploratory coal pits gave some evidence towards post-medieval, early modern activity, perhaps even into the late medieval. So while these coal pits may be modern, there is potentially some evidence that they are part of earlier activity. And it may be that these coal pits actually, rather than it being coal extraction just purely for coal as a resource, it may be linked to the lime quarrying, perhaps as a lime kiln, to fuel a lime kiln for creation of lime for fertiliser, for farming, but also for mortar. The quarry was also used for building material too. What we did see in the environmental samples, and one of the notes from Susan Ramsey, who carried out the environmental analysis, was that there was quite a bit of contamination in the samples. Some of the samples were sterile and contained quite a high proportion of clinker coal. At New Creek Hole, we see a very similar site, perhaps more visible evidence of that industrial activity. We did have a prehistoric landscape with a series of Mesolithic to Bronze Age pits. There's also extensive remains of rig and furrow, as well as field boundaries and ditches evidence across the site. So we do have that evidence of medieval agricultural activity. There was also the mining village of New Creek Hall, and there were also various sized coal pits following these coal seams, which again, as with the Landlord, were very close to the surface. One pit, pit 36, contained medieval white gritty ware dating to the 12th and 15th century. So we can suggest that some of these coal pits, these small exploratory pits, were again evidence of an earlier small-scale coal extraction. And we know from historical accounts that the monks of Newbattle Abbey owned this area and were one of the earliest exploiters of coal resources in Scotland. So we know that they gained the bulk of their income from coal mining, and most of this coal would go towards the fueling of pans for salt extraction, which is situated to the coast, the East Lothian coastline. In terms of the later industrial mining activity, we do see a number of collieries in this site. The Klondike Colliery, for example, was opened in 1897 and it didn't close until 1968. We found across the site footings of structures relating to colliery buildings and infilled mine shafts. Interestingly, there was also evidence of a 18th century designed landscape associated with Brunston House, and that came with culverts and a haw-haw, which is for enclosing of cattle to make it look more natural. So you can't actually see this ditch boundary, but it means that the cattle or livestock can't cross that. So it's to have more of an open landscape rather than having fencing. So we can see here from the survey from New Craighall and New Craighall South, the green stripes here representing the rig and furrow. You can also see the grey lines here, which are marking the coal seams, and you can see the coal pits and mine shafts which follow those coal seams. So we do have evidence in both sites of quite significant industrial activity. But how do we actually view the development and transformation of that landscape? One thing that we are very tempted to do is think of a very rapid change, and certainly our view of the Industrial Revolution is that we see within a matter of one generation, a few decades, the landscape changing completely from one of a rural agricultural landscape to something which is completely unrecognisable. But what we perhaps should do is think about a much more gradual change. And we've got a nice picture here from Bruegel the Elder. And this is showing, it's a picture called The Harvesters from 1565. And this is perhaps a scene that we can maybe think about in East Lothian, where we have an agricultural landscape, small scale settlement, land enclosure, a settlement on the coast, and farm workers working the land. And what we think about when we look at the Industrial Revolution is something that changes to something like this, which is the Hascock Rig Colliery in Shotts, North Lanarkshire. So when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think about this very peaceful scene, and then it changing completely to this scene where we almost see a devastation of that landscape, something that is completely different. However, what SCARF, the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, would invite us to do is to rethink of this Industrial Revolution as having such an extreme impact on the landscape, and perhaps think about it as having a less intensive industrial impact. So we take the chapter here from SCARF, looking at the Industrial Revolution. What it says is the Industrial Revolution has traditionally been defined as a phenomenon of the 18th and 19th centuries, but research has shown that less intense industrial development started considerably earlier in some sectors in some places. And some researchers now prefer to think in terms of a long industrial revolution extending back through the 17th, 16th, and even 15th centuries. So perhaps what we need to do is, rather than thinking about this dramatic change, think about a more gradual change. And actually what we see potentially, certainly in the archaeology from Landlord and West Edge, is an ebbing and flowing of this industrial change, this transformation from agriculture back to industry, back to agriculture again, depending on demand of the resources. And when we think about this medieval extraction of coal, certainly at New Craighall, perhaps by these New Battle monks, or by landowners who are becoming more aware of this resource which is underneath their feet, rather than thinking purely of the agricultural resource, we see the development of mining technology in the form of these bell pits, which can date from the 15th century onwards. And what we see at the top here is a very small pit, and then the shaft going downwards towards downwards to expose a coal seam, which potentially may not be that far down, and maybe actually quite close to the surface. You certainly couldn't do this without using later more modern technology using mine shafts, for example. So perhaps what we're actually seeing is the use of these bell pits, and actually how visible are they in the landscape? What change are we actually seeing here? How much change can be seen by the surrounding communities, by the people who actually lived here? Would they even notice, for example, a small wooden rig being put up in some of these fields? And would they come and go as that resource demand changed? So rather than seeing a massive colliery being built, there is actually perhaps more of a development of that industrial impact. And how involved would people in this community be? Would there be a change in skill set, so they begin to specialise in mining activity rather than agriculture? In terms of the archaeological impact of these bell pits or small scale open extraction of coal, we do see in New Craig Hall and Landlord very small pits and some pit alignments which are matching the coal seams that are close to the surface. And one of these mining pits that we mentioned earlier, pit 36, does have that medieval white gritty wear within the fill. So we can suggest that these are earlier forms of coal extraction dating from that earlier period. So we are seeing that longer industrial revolution in these sites. We're seeing a very gradual process towards an industrial landscape, and again one that ebbs and flows. At New Craig Hall, this develops further into what we would consider to be the high industrial period of the 19th and 20th centuries, when there is a further move in that coal extraction technology with the creation of collieries and much deeper mine shafts to be able to access those deeper coal seams. And so we do have the creation of mining structures that are adjacent to the collieries. And we can see that here in structures 3 and structure 1, which are very small scale purpose-built buildings, perhaps to process the coal, perhaps even form some kind of shelter for the miners who are on site. But again, this is very small scale and isn't really visible out with the archaeological record. We don't even really see it on the Ordnance Survey. Certainly on Roy's map here of Landlord, we don't see any evidence of 18th century coal mining. Maybe we shouldn't really expect to. But when we actually even look at the Ordnance Survey of the late 19th century, we don't really see much evidence of that smaller scale coal extraction. We do see references to old coal pits, old shafts. We've got just to the west the Morton Hall pit. One of the things that does have a wider industrial impact actually is not the coal extraction, but the limestone quarrying, which have left large scars in the landscape. And we can see that here in the Ordnance Survey. This is a really good example of what that kind of quarrying activity would look like. And this is from Hales Quarry in Slateford in Edinburgh. So you can see the quite large scale impact it's had in the landscape. It has scooped it out in a sense. There's also the infrastructure which is associated with that, which would cause its own impact, such as roads and bridges and also other ancillary buildings. One thing that you can see from this photograph, however, in the background here is the rural agricultural landscape, which seems to sit adjacent to that quarry and shows that actually that agricultural landscape is coinciding with that industrial landscape. So rather than thinking about having straight off an agricultural landscape to an industrial landscape, actually really what we're seeing here is a coinciding of those two. They are existing together in the same space. So both Langloan and New Craig Hall show evidence of their industrial past. Two different levels. We can see at Langloan, it's really the quarrying that has left that visible mark. And New Craig Hall, we do see evidence of that later industrial activity. However, what we do see is the remains of the medieval agricultural activity, which has survived alongside that. And New Craig Hall, the high industrial period of the 18th, 19th century, is visible through the development of the settlement of the mining village at New Craig Hall, and also further infrastructure to support that colliery. At Langloan, the coal extraction is potentially quite minor, except when you look at the archaeological landscape. And it really being the quarrying that is leaving that greatest impact. Because when we look at the 1880s OS map, the local landscape is primarily agriculture again. However, what we should really see is rather than an explosion of industrial activity that completely transformed the landscape in what we would consider to be the Industrial Revolution, what we are actually seeing here is more of a slow burn with gradual small-scale change. These exploratory coal pits dating from the medieval period onwards peppered this landscape amongst the rigs of oats and barley, and probably became quite a well-known feature within that landscape. They coincided together. And so from the medieval period, there has been really a continual phase of landscape transformation relating to industry as part of this long industrial revolution, beginning with small pockets of activity. And what we do see here in both these sites, I think, which is particularly interesting, is a microcosm of industrial change. So we do see that very beginning of that medieval landscape, and we see that change all the way through to the modern period. So we're actually, through the archaeological record, we are seeing that visible transformation from medieval to modern. And what I would posit for looking at further landscape change is that it doesn't just stop, it doesn't just go back, revert to agriculture through a deindustrialization, because perhaps what we're seeing now is an urban revolution. Both of these sites at New Craig Hall and at Langloan have been subject to housing development, which is part of a new 21st century landscape. And so what we want to maybe think about is how is subject, will this also be subject to change in the future? And will this again revert back to agriculture as things change? Is this going to be part of the same ebb and flow of that landscape transformation? I would like to thank you again for allowing me to record this, and I'm very sorry that we won't be here in person. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Alan Hunter-Blair, who was the director at New Craig Hall, and also Dave McNichol and Thomas Muir, who directed the excavations at Langloan. If you have any questions about what I brought up here, then please email me. My email address is just there, and do visit the Arrow publications, which will give you more context about those sites. Thank you very much.